Welcome to Thinking Like a Lawyer with your hosts Ellie Mistal and Joe Patrice, talking about legal news and pop culture, all while thinking like a lawyer. Here on Legal Talk Network.
Hello, welcome to another edition of Thinking Like a Lawyer. I'm Joe Patrice from Above the Law. I am joined as never by nobody. We don't have Catherine here. She, as you might imagine, given that we record this the week before you hear it, this is a fairly busy time. There's Senate confirmation hearings and giant tech conferences all going on at once, and it leads to us not having a full complement. But that said, you're in, reasonable hands with me just chatting. What we're going to do for you today is have a quick rundown of a couple of the big stories of the week, as we usually do. And then we're going to have a special interview with Jack Newton of Clio about what's going on at the Clio Cloud Conference, which is, if you are longtime listeners to the show or readers of Above the Law, know that that's one of my all-time favorite conferences to go to. And this year, obviously, we can't go anywhere. So it was handled virtually, and we'll talk a little bit about what went on and what was revealed and announced there with Jack. But for now, let's get right into it and talk about some of the big stories of the week. And I think the biggest story that we can cover for the week was learning that Seyfarth has some tech problems. It turns out that over the holiday weekend, the firm was hit by a cyber attack. On the good side, it seems as though it was able to recover and contain the attack, and in a way that did not involve any client data being lost. But, we mock attorneys all the time for being, how shall we say this, not tech savvy, which isn't totally fair because obviously, there are a lot of gadgeteering among lawyers. These are people who had BlackBerries and their phones do all these cool things. They understand how to look stuff up on Lexis. But what they don't understand is how the technology actually works. They're very good at pushing buttons on very user-friendly materials, but don't understand why, hitting the executable file that's randomly attached to some suspicious email might be a problem. So that's another moment this weekend where we learned that was a continuing problem among the legal set. Technically, Seyfarth put out a statement explaining that they were hit by a sophisticated and aggressive malware attack, which notice that they never say that it's a simplistic or passive attack. I don't know if that's just because, on the one hand, you could argue that that's because something so simplistic and passive would be easily caught by existing virus filters. The other side would be to say that it's good PR to pretend that the thing that you got bit by was super sophisticated. One way or the other, though, this was a ransomware attack that seems to have been targeted at not just this firm, but other entities as well. And ransomware is one of those things that doesn't really hit willy-nilly. It tends to be something that enters the firm through some bug between the keyboard and the chair, as some people quip. Some user error brings it in, whether they're agreeing to represent a Nigerian prince to get their money back or something along those lines. It's a mistake happens that brings the ransomware into the house. And thankfully, the real heroes here were the IT department, who were able to catch it and protect the system and prevent anything from being lost or stolen, especially client confidences and data. As we know, law firms are kind of the soft underbelly of the corporate espionage world. We learned that was the Panama Papers situation. Secrets, you can do an end run around a company's attempt to keep its secrets by going after their law firm, which tends to be less savvy historically. Thankfully here, even though somebody screwed up to let this through the door, an IT department was there to protect everybody from themselves. This is going to continue to be a big problem in law firms going forward, but, it's just worth noting that this is still out there, and if your firm is not prepared to deal with it, you probably should be, because this is the way of the future now. Speaking of law firms, How have law firms weathered previous economic downturns and come out stronger on the other side? LexisNexis Interaction has released an in-depth global research report confronting the 2020 downturn, lessons learned during previous economic crises. Download your free copy at interaction.com/likealawyer to see tips, strategies, plans, and statistics from leaders who have been through this before and how they reached success again. As we said, one of the big stories of the week that we record this was the Senate confirmation hearings for Judge Amy Kovet Barrett, as we have called her. The epicenter of the White House COVID outbreak has hearings that were ongoing. And one of the biggest highlights, the what will people remember from this scenes, involved Judge Barrett holding up a notepad that was empty when she was asked by the senators, what notes do you have in front of you as you're giving all these impressive answers, which weren't particularly impressive. They were kind of mundane legal answers, but whatever. People are easily impressed. And she revealed she had no notes, which some people seemed to fawn over as though that was impressive. It didn't particularly seem impressive given the answers, but also it really was the most embarrassing possible answer from the perspective of somebody who is a lawyer and has been in this profession, because whether or not somebody can make answers off the top of their head is less important, I think, to those of us who are real lawyers, which I know most of the listeners here are, and those that aren't are aspiring lawyers. Being able to answer things off the top of your head is not particularly impressive. What's impressive from a professional standpoint is how much work you put into getting to the point where you could have answers. We talked in the past with Neil Katyal recently. One of the things that he often says is that he will put together for every argument reams and reams of notebooks that have everything under the sun and then never look at them when the day comes. But he has them. And it's that work that's the core of being an attorney. And the idea that you answer things without notes is really more a display of utter contempt for the process than a display that you're actually good at the process. And this then led us into it was one of those moments, and how everybody fawned over it. And then because karma is, a bitch, the thing that happened the next day was she ran afoul of not knowing what the First Amendment actually says. It became a viral gotcha moment, but it also is one of those situations that shouldn't really be a gotcha moment because the question itself is stupid. There's not really a reason why a judge would need to know off the top of their head the text of these amendments. We don't expect them to render decisions without ever consulting the original text of something, without consulting the scholarship and precedent that surrounds it. There was no real fear that she wasn't going to know what the First Amendment was once the time came for her to make a decision. Whether she was going to ignore what it actually says, knowing full well what it says, is a whole different question. But she wasn't going to just not know. That really became and yes, not having notes probably contributes to that, but it's also a stupid question. Why would she have had notes explaining what the specific text of stuff was? Why are senators asking questions about, do you have off the top of your head the rule against perpetuities? This is indicative of kind of the problem. And I know we've talked a lot about the bar exam over the last several weeks and my problems with it as a professional licensing device. But it really is the culmination of the problems with the bar exam. Like, the logical conclusion of all that is where you end up here. You end up with a situation where people think that the guide to competence is knowing more obscure details about the law off the top of your head, which is not how law is practiced. It's not how a justice would ever act. It's more important to see, and this brings us back to the notes, it's more important for us to see that they put work into it, that a justice took the time to read things. What did they read? Did they read this treatment? Did they also read this contradictory treatment? How did they resolve the differences between the two? These are the questions that actually show somebody is, name check plug, thinking like a lawyer. That's what's valuable to understand whether or not somebody is competent, whether it's competent to be a first-year attorney or a judge or a justice of the Supreme Court. There may be differences in degree, but it is all about testing that capacity to do the work in this research-intensive profession. So ultimately, while people fawned over not having notes and ridiculed her for not knowing the answer to this question off the top of her head, it really should be reversed. We should be embarrassed as a profession that somebody went into this hearing without any materials, and we should be giving her a lot of slack, frankly, for not knowing certain things off the top of her head, because that's a stupid test. And that's why we shouldn't have it be the way in which we test minimum competency for anything. Anyway, it's just worrying that this is where everything is now, you know? It's as though like the whole profession is just missing the whole trick to how it itself should run. You know, speaking of missing, if you work with contracts and don't use contract tools, you're missing a lot. Save time, make more money, and do a better job for your clients with Contract Tools by Paper Software. Contract Tools is the most powerful Word add-in for working with contracts. Thousands of lawyers all over the world rely on Contract Tools every day for every kind of deal. Visit papersoftware.com to watch a demo and get a free trial. As a special offer to podcast listeners, use coupon code LTN2020 to get 1 month free. That's papersoftware.com and LTN 2020. Well, now we're going to welcome in Jack Newton, CEO and co-founder of Clio. Jack has been running a conference all week, and we got an opportunity to check in with him about what was going on. And so we're going to jump to that recorded conversation now and chat again on the backside. So we're joined by Jack Newton. Hey, how are you?
I am fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, so thanks for joining us. You're in the middle of a fairly busy time for you. This is, and it's even busier than usual because now you've got it over 4 days. So
that's right. It's it's on the home stretch now. It's the last day of the conference. Super excited for day 4 to open up shortly here with Seth Godin and his opening keynote for day 4. But yeah, it was a weird feeling actually at the end of day 2 to realize we're only halfway through. Usually we'd be wrapping up and popping champagne and celebrating, but this year, as with so many things, it's felt a lot different.
Yeah, I didn't think of it beforehand, but I really like the idea of making it 4 days if it has to be virtual. People in different time zones and all, just like having shorter days, longer week has certainly helped out a lot.
Yeah, that was a deliberate choice on our end where we thought about how can we adapt the format to take advantage of some of the elements of virtual. And we thought one of the big advantages of virtual is that you don't need to walk away from your life in quite the same way you do as when you go to a real physical conference. And, this way people can, number one, as you pointed out, attend from any time zone. We have people attending from 46 countries around the world, if you can believe it. So it's a worldwide event, and we've tried to make the calendar align for as many waking hour time zones as possible. And we also have left time in the day for people to do the rest of their lives. Whether that's kids or work or keeping up with clients. You don't need to quite go dark in the same way that you needed to for the 2-day physical ClioCon.
Well, yeah, and it's been such a journey this year for virtual conferences. As everyone's tried to do it, everyone's learning a new thing each iteration. Right. And I do think that the way in which you've done this takes a lot of the lessons that we were picking up from others. I certainly went to some virtual conferences where I thought, well, but everything's going on all day, and I can't do this and that. Just
right.
a shorter, more targeted day that gives you an opportunity to come in and out as needed, but also longer time so you don't miss anything. It's definitely been an experience that it's clear that you benefited from coming later in the year and could have seen what some of the other folks had tried and worked out a new system.
Yeah. Well, it was interesting when we pivoted ClioCon to being virtual. It wasn't actually a foregone conclusion for us at all that it was going to be a virtual alternate to the physical conference. When we, back in March, when COVID first hit, we were optimistic that, hey, maybe this will blow over by October. Yeah. By April, we were starting to realize that those hopes were probably misplaced. And by May, we were pulling force majeure on our venue and evaluating whether we were going to go virtual or not. And
yeah,
And my experience, what my mandate to the team almost was based on my experience of virtual conferences up to that point. So not commenting on any of the more
Right, of
recent
course.
legal virtual conferences, but my comment was every virtual conference I've gone to has sucked. Just full stop. And if we do ClioCon virtual, it can't suck. That was really the simple mandate to the team. So the initial ask from me was go out and research what's available out there in terms of platforms and other ways we could make this interesting and engaging, because I would rather not do a conference at all than do something that doesn't live up to what people expect of a ClioCon. So I think you're right. We've learned some lessons from what we've seen work and not work at other conferences. We've kind of innovated in our own way around what we think could make a virtual conference great, and take advantage of, I think it's important. The medium is different than a physical conference, and let's take advantage of some of the things that it permits. So I've been thrilled with how it's worked out, and you're right. A lot of what you see, everything from the programming being live to being more punctuated, shorter days, and being spread out over 4 days is a very deliberate design to hopefully drive engagement and attendee engagement.
Yeah. Well, and one of the benefits that you have over some other legal conferences is that you're speaking to a community, really.
Right.
You're talking to a base of folks who are already somewhat bought in, which is nice because there are people who are familiar, who have networks and pre-existing relationships that make them want to be there and engaged. And it seems like that's a big part of making a conference work, is having an audience that actually is super interested in the engagement with it. No.
Yeah. In fact, I think that's actually everything there is to making a conference that works. If you have, it's the community, the attendees that bring that energy. And really, when we ask ourselves the questions, I think the crucial question for any virtual conference is, why isn't this a set of webinars sitting on YouTube?
Right.
And if you don't have a good answer to that question, it should just be a bunch of webinars sitting on YouTube ready for on-demand consumption. And the answer to that question is there's no community around a webinar sitting on YouTube. And what we tried to create with ClioCon virtual and the physical event as well is a community of legal professionals that are innovators, that are passionate about the confluence of technology and law and the opportunity to innovate and do things differently in legal. And it's the number one thing we hear back from attendees in terms of what keeps them coming back year after year is, it's not like another conference where you need to spend 3/4 of your time just weeding out the people that, kind of don't think about the world the same way you do and aren't as innovative and not as forward thinking. With ClioCon, you can just jump right in the deep end in any conversation and know that you've got this certain baseline level of mutual understanding with other attendees. And what really excited me and made me happy was that I saw that community coming to life in this virtual environment. You saw it happening on the chat, in the sessions. You saw it happening at roundtables. We saw people, sharing best practices at these virtual roundtables, meeting with our support team and other teams, learning how to use Clio better. So it was very cool to see people engaging really deeply with each other virtually.
So for folks who, since this is going to come out at the show will have concluded, for folks who want to go back and do, we already kind of spoiled it, who do want to experience it as a series of webinars, what stood out to you? What were your favorite moments of the show as you've been going through it? Obviously, we still have a day left, so maybe the favorite thing is later today, but what have you loved so far?
There's a long list, but I think I'll try to be as brief as possible. Number one, I take a lot of joy in delivering my opening keynote and sharing some of the exciting findings from the legal trends report and dropping some new features for Clio as well. So I think we had, our best and most groundbreaking in a lot of ways legal trends report ever this year. And we can talk more about that later, but that was an exciting moment for me. A couple of big features, in particular, our partnership with Google and Google My Business and that integration with Clio, I think is super relevant to lawyers today as they're trying to move their practices to the cloud and stand out on the web in a more distinct way. and our Clio for Clients app that allows you to easily collaborate with clients on the go securely, through a smartphone app is another feature I was really excited to take the covers off of. Our keynote speakers have been phenomenal. We had Ben Crump open up the conference on Wednesday morning with his opening keynote for Tuesday, and man, what a powerful speech. He was giving that speech on what would have been George Floyd's birthday, which was profound and moving moment for, I think, the audience to recognize. And he's speaking to an audience that can have influence and help drive this fight for equality forward. And he really made the most of that moment and had a large impact with our audience. And again, virtual environment, but you saw people commenting in the chat. They were moved to tears, and this great shared experience listening to Ben Crump talk about social justice and so many of the topics that are the forefront of our mind right now around racism and defeating some of the systemic racism that exists in our justice system. We heard yesterday from Angela Duckworth, who is the author of one of my favorite books, Grit, and she gave just both an amazing presentation, and I had the privilege of doing an hour of Q&A with her, so a lot of great questions from the audience, and a unique opportunity for me to ask some of my number one questions I've been holding back for Angela for ever since reading Grit years ago, so that was exciting. And later this morning, we're going to have Seth Godin, who I'm sure Joe, but he's not super well known in the legal field, but is the marketer of all marketers, the author of 19 best-selling books. Just a phenomenal. If you read his blog or his Twitter feed for 5 minutes, you'll fall in love with his ideas on how to stand out and how to define yourself in marketing. Another session that stood out for me, and I haven't had the opportunity to sit on all of the sessions yet because the team was rude enough to sign me up for hosting and moderating stuff over the course of the conference. But one of the sessions I was able to attend live yesterday was Brian Cuban's session talking about addiction and recovery, and heard several people comment that it was the most powerful speech they'd seen, any conference in person or virtual ever. And he was just raw and honest about his struggle with addiction and his path to recovery. And, I think it's something, especially in this COVID era, people are struggling with more so than ever. And, it was a message that resonated and I think was really needed for the audience at the kind of environment we're all navigating right now. Yeah. So that's the bit of the highlight reel, but we're rounding out. And the live entertainment I completely forgot to mention, but we've had Ben Harper perform live for us at the end of day 2. We had Nathaniel Rateliff close out day 3 yesterday with just he's one of my favorite performers and gave an amazing solo acoustic set for the conference. We had Stephanie Izard, one of my favorite chefs she's this chef at Girl and the Goat and all the affiliated restaurants in Chicago. And she gave us a cooking lesson on Tuesday. And Questlove is closing out the conference today. So we've had the biggest and best live entertainment we've ever had at ClioCon as well. So that was very cool as well, seeing on social people sharing screenshots of them jamming to Nathaniel or Ben at home. It was very cool.
Yeah, always over the top, Clio, and even if it's virtual, you managed to do it again. So it's a good segue, though, because you mentioned your opening keynote and the legal trends report. This is, for those of us legal nerds, this is like our favorite part of ClioCon, is that
it's like Christmas for legal nerds.
Yeah, exactly. We get to see all the data that you've managed to collect over the years. So what were some of the big takeaways for you from the legal trends report this year?
Yeah, well, you and I were chatting about that a little bit in the preamble, Joe. Like, this is the biggest and most expansive legal trends report we've ever published, and I think there's a few headlines, but I would encourage everyone to download and read it. I'd be audacious enough to say it should be required reading for any lawyer that wants to figure out what the world's going to look like in the coming months and years, because it's changing, and it's changing rapidly. There's been a tectonic shift in terms of how consumers are embracing and adopting technology, number one. And we know that, I think, anecdotally through our own experiences. We're doing Zoom calls with our parents and grandparents that, previously wouldn't have been able to hardly make a phone call. And yet here we are in a live video chat with them. We've seen mass adoption of technology, a massive shift also in consumer expectations, not just in terms of how they consume legal services, but in terms of how they consume every service. And again, we see this on our front doorsteps with, the stacks of Amazon packages, and the way people buy, the way people are consuming is different. So that's one headline. And I think some of the takeaway messages for law firms are consumers are expecting lawyers to go virtual. So we actually saw a majority of consumers tell us that they believe that most legal services can be delivered virtually. They would prefer to meet with their lawyer and consume legal services over a Zoom call over any other format for a meeting. So unsurprisingly, meeting in person is not high on the list. But this, as well as some other data points from this year's Legal Trends report, to me, it begs the question: is there the need for a physical bricks and mortar law office for many lawyers? And my personal take is that it's not an emphatic no quite yet, but it's trending in that direction. And the way I think law offices are used in the future is going to be vastly different than the way they were used, in the beginning of 2020. We're seeing lawyers also adopt technology very rapidly. And for the first time, really in the Legal Trends Report history, we've seen lawyers adopting technology more aggressively than consumers believe they are. So they're actually ahead of the curve, if you want to think of it that way, adopting video conferencing, e-signatures, cloud-based tools. So that technology adoption is very exciting to see on the lawyer side. One of the bolder statements that we make in the Legal Trends Report that I reinforced in my opening keynote as well is that we think what ties a lot of the data points together in the Legal Trends Report is that the future for law firms is being cloud-based and client-centered. And by cloud-based, what I mean is not the way I spoke about being cloud-based back in 2008 when we launched Clio, and this idea that you're moving your practice management system from on-prem to the cloud. What I'm talking about with cloud-based is you're actually moving your whole law firm to the cloud. Like, you're thinking about how every piece of your law firm operates in the cloud, how you collaborate with your colleagues in the cloud, how you acquire clients online in the cloud, how you transact and deliver your work product to your clients in the cloud, how you get paid in the cloud. So it's this end-to-end journey. And this is where we're seeing legal, I believe, for the first time, truly being fundamentally transformed by the internet. And I think we're on the cusp of a very exciting evolutionary phase for the legal industry. And being client-centered is something I'm passionate about. And, I obviously wrote the book on it about this. And I've got a lot to say about it, and I won't get too far down that rabbit hole in our podcast here. But what I believe is that lawyers from the ground up need to redesign and re-engineer the way they are delivering legal services to account for, number one, the fact those services are being delivered over the internet. So there's a totally new modality for the delivery of legal services. And legal services have traditionally never been really client-centered in the way they've been designed. They've been very much lawyer-centered in the way they've been designed. Even artifacts like the billable hour, I believe, are good reflections of how legal services have traditionally been fairly lawyer-centered in their design. And we're gonna have to fix that problem. We see the World Justice Project data telling us that 77% of consumers don't have their legal needs met by a lawyer. There's this vast latent legal market that I talk about in my book as well, the 77% of consumers that aren't accessing legal services. And that 77%, that below the waterline part of the iceberg that is growing fast, by the way. And the other important data point to take away from this year's Legal Trends Report is that consumers are more unable than ever to afford legal services. They are holding back on accessing lawyers overall because they can't afford legal services and because they believe currently that the justice system can't service them. They believe because of court closures and other headlines they're reading, they actually believe that law offices are closed. There's almost a third of consumers that told us, and this was another very surprising data point from the consumer survey we did, nearly a third of consumers believe law offices are just closed outright. And that blew me away. And I think it's a good example of how consumers can sometimes extrapolate incorrectly from the headlines they're reading to conclude how our law office is operating. So those are a few of the big takeaways from this year's Legal Trends Report. The final point I'll make, I talked about some of the data to support this idea of being client-centered and cloud-based. The data is really exciting in that we talk about this concept of the aggregation of marginal gains. And we saw that law firms that adopt cloud-based technologies and are client-centered in the way that they design legal services have massive advantages over their peers that do not. And if you adopt these cloud-based and client-centered technologies, the net gains you're driving for your law firm is on the order of a 40% increase in revenue relative to your peers that are not adopting these technologies. So it's not just a philosophical thing. It's not just being client-centered because it sounds good and it's the way you should be delivering legal services. It's actually better for your bottom line as well. Yeah. And that's really I think another takeaway headline from this year's Legal Trends Report for me as well is this has a massive impact on revenues and can impact both the top line and bottom line for a law firm in a really positive way.
Right. I should let you get back to this. Thanks for taking some time to join us. Congratulations on running a conference in the middle of all of this that went so successfully.
Yeah. Well, thanks for being part of it, Joe, and thanks for having me on the show.
Always. Yeah. That, of course, is Jack Newton, CEO of Clio and author of The Client-Centered Law Firm, which you should check out also. And we will be right back. Well, thank you so much for listening to the show. You should be subscribed. You should give it reviews, not just stars. You should also write something. Just that act of engaging by just writing something shows that you're more interested, which means that it, those entities take that into account when they recommend it to people. So it's a good thing to do. You should be reading Above the Law, of course. You should be following. I'm at Joseph Patrice on Twitter. You should be listening to our other shows. We have that ATL Kovet cast as well as the Jabot. You should listen to the other offerings of the Legal Talk Network. Another thanks to Contract Tools by Paper Software. Check out your free trial as discussed. And with all of that said, we will be back hopefully with a co-host next week.
If you'd like more information about what you've heard today, please visit LegalTalkNetwork.com. You can also find us at AboveTheLaw.com, ATLRedline.com, iTunes, RSS, Twitter, and Facebook. The views expressed by the participants of this program are their own and do not represent the views of, nor are they endorsed by, Legal Talk Network, its officers, directors, employees, agents, representatives, shareholders, and subsidiaries. None of the content should be considered legal advice. As always, consult a lawyer.